It's late on Friday night. I'm excited because I know where all my stuff's going to hang, but I'm not going to be a crazy person and do that. So instead, we're going to read some from Herbie. So maybe I'll get tired and watch an episode of The Good Place while I eat ice cream. And then go to bed. Reading from It's About Time by Wiles, Volume 1 of History, starting page 23. The Nature of the Hebrew Language. Our intent in these next two chapters is to neither discredit the King James Version, the translators, nor the 54 scholars. We need to uncover some of the problems encountered by the language translators so that we may focus our efforts on the largest probability of error. We need to know why a perfect English translation was nearly impossible. We will seek a general understanding of the ancient languages and compare them with modern English. Alternate translations will be shown in this chapter only as examples, but in later chapters we will get into alternate translations as they are encountered in the text. I may write boldly on both Hebrew and Greek, although I'm far from being an expert on either. The statements I make comes from years of hard study, and I'm saving you time by giving a synopsis of my research. If you have doubts about what I say, check me out. What I say can stand the scrutiny. The Hebrew language. Hebrew phraseology. Hebrew is an archaic pictorial language having only a few words when compared to English or Greek. The words were very broad in meaning, and that makes them somewhat ambiguous when translating word by word. An accurate translation of Hebrew can only be achieved by considering the surrounding text. One phrase may have a totally different meaning when placed in a different context. In some cases, translating Hebrew phrases into English becomes an educated guessing game. For example, the King James Version renders Genesis 5:24 as, "And Enoch walked with God." However, the more recent Moffat translation renders the identical verse, "And Enoch lived close to God." One translation does not seem to correspond with the other. Which is the more accurate translation? Was this Hebrew verb translated walked in the King James Version, recording a stroll in the park with God, or was it recording Enoch's agreeable manner in God's eyes? We need to deduce our answer from the context. The correct focus is indicated by the two phrases following the one in question. "And he was not, for God took him." If God took up Enoch, then God was obviously pleased with the agreeable manner of Enoch. Paul's writings confirm Moffat's translation. Hebrews 11:5, "By faith Enoch was translated, raptured to heaven, that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God." Why are you twitching? Say hi to David. The focus was on Enoch's agreeable manner with God, and the most accurate translation is the Moffat. However, the Hebrew verb translated walked in the King James Version was never used by Moffat, yet he managed to capture the pictorial meaning of the verse and translated its meaning more accurately. I will also translate some of the Hebrew Old Testament similar to Moffat. The meaning of what was said is more important than the actual words. Hebrew word transliterations. The English transliterations of Hebrew words and names can also be a stumbling block to clarity. The ancient Hebrew was a totally consonantal language, having no vowels or vowel indicators. The addition of the vowel sounds in many cases was purely translator speculation. On more than one occasion, different teams of translators used different vowel sounds in the same Hebrew consonantal names. A good example of this is in the Hebrew name Zr. Some translators render it Ezra, and with others it became Zerah or Zerah. This not only confused the name, but we later encounter in the King James Version people known as Zerahites, Ezrahites, and Israhites. As strange as it sounds, these are all the same people, children of a patriarch named Zr. This little detail has been overlooked by the majority of modern Bible scholars because they don't take time to understand Hebrew to English transliteration problems. A silly story. Let me overstress this point with a silly story. Let's say a foreign student overheard a story in the supermarket about a farmer and some wordplay on chickens. He was not expert on the American language. How would he later spell and demonstrate the word chickens in his native tongue? He would pronounce and probably spell the word phonetically, and it would probably come out something like chickens when transliterated back into English. The student loved the story and wanted to write it home to his parents, but they spoke only their native tongue. The word was written as chickens in the letter. The student's mother never heard of a chickens and attempted to look up the word in her native language, English lexicon. How can she deduce that the phonetic spelling chickens in her language was actually spelled chickens in English? She obviously missed the point of this silly story, but did you? The point is, whenever words are transliterated from one language into another, they usually become altered both in spelling and pronunciation because of the separate way letters or words are pronounced in another language. If we hear a Japanese word, we don't write it down in Japanese, we write it as it sounds to us in English, our mother tongue. This is a problem encountered by the King James translators with words from the original Hebrew. English, German, and French-speaking archaeologists had the same problem. They uncovered ancient Median, Persian, Greek, and Assyrian words that were transliterations of Hebrew words and names. Many were so far removed from the original that they were unrecognizable. The modern study of word origins is called etymology. We will get into some etymology in later chapters because some of the ancient names from archaeology are the keys to unlocking proof important to our case. Etymologists may disagree with some of my conclusions because etymology is not a very precise science. It is hard to come up with total agreement on the origin of many of the ancient word forms. Hebrew verbs. Hebrew verbs also created problems for the translators. Edmund Wilson wrote about 30 books on history and related subjects. He had understanding of 5 foreign languages, including Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Wilson is better qualified to teach on Hebrew verbs than I. They did not conjugate their verbs for tenses as the modern Western languages do, since our modern concept of time was something at which they had not yet arrived. What the Hebrews had instead of tenses were 2 fundamental conjugations for perfect and imperfect, that is, for action completed and action uncompleted. And both of these 2 aspects theoretically exist in 7 variations for every verb that have nothing to do with time. It is not a question of when something happens, but whether the thing is completed or certain to be completed. These intensives are sometimes baffling. It is not always easy to see what is implied in a given context. The forms may, in certain cases, turn intransitive into transitive verbs. The intensive of to learn may mean to teach, or indicate multiplicity or frequency. By comparing Hebrew verbs to English verbs, there is no such thing in Hebrew as the present tense of a verb. Comparatively, they are either past or future tense, complete or incomplete. When the translators used the present tense of the translated verb, they were more than not speculating about the Hebrew intent. Although this seems to be a minor point when dealing with prophecy versus history, the verb tenses become very important. One has occurred and the other has not yet occurred. This is why some of the scriptures encountered in later chapters may require the verbs being altered in reading. We will be able to do this because of modern archaeology and known history. Uncial texts. The 9th and 10th century codices were all written in uncial, all capital letter script. This script had no punctuation other than a double diamond symbol, similar to our colon that denoted the end of the verse. We can usually deduce the verse endings from the numbers that the translators added, but they seemed to have been hung up on using colons and semicolons, and that only adds to the confusion. Most of the uncial texts had no clear separation between the words. Some appeared to be one long line of letters and looked to the translators something like this. Proper names. Not only did this style of writing make it hard to separate the words, it also made deducing proper names tough. Which words were to be capitalized as names and which words were to be translated. The Hebrew language doesn't help because all Hebrew names are translatable. Understand that some words became names and were not translated as they should have been, and vice versa. We will have to retranslate some of these words and names to gain a better understanding of what was being said. Paragraph breaks. The ancients wrote as if the whole scroll was one long paragraph. There were no paragraph separations, indentations, or indicators. Every chapter and paragraph break of the King James Version is the deductive work of earlier translators, and they made some errors. On a few occasions, they actually broke into the middle of a thought or example and placed a paragraph break. Although they tried their best to be neutral, some 17th century concepts became filtered into the translation. There are only a few of these errors, but we will look for them and try to weed them out also. Written backward. Hebrew is written from right to left and English from left to right. Some have theorized it was written this way because stonecutters held their chisels in the left hand and hammers in their right. Therefore, it would be natural for them to write backward to those who write right-handed. I don't happen to hold with this theory. Ancient Hebrew and Arabic traditions claim that Enoch was the inventor of writing, and he simply was probably left-handed. Writing from right to left is perfectly natural to left-handed people. I tend to agree with these traditions only because several other Hebrew and Arabic traditions have been proven to be accurate through archaeology. Who really knows or cares? Nonetheless, Hebrew is written from right to left, and their books seem to be backward from the Western way of thinking. Hebrew numbers. Hebrew has no separate number characters. The regular old 22-letter alphabet had a numerical value assigned to each letter. The numerical value of a letter was denoted by adding a stroke, similar looking to an apostrophe, after that letter. See the chart on the following page for each letter's assigned number. I think it's a great chart here. If you want to see it, leave it in the comments. I'll scan it or do something fabulous. Hebrew numbers more than 400 were ganged together to form that number. In later Hebrew writings, the letters took on a totally different look that made the letters as numbers system very confusing. A few centuries later, the system was finally changed and the numbers were phonetically spelled out, but not before several numerical errors had already crept into the scriptures. What created even more errors were the later scribes attempting to rectify the erroneous numbers without having an accurate cross-reference to work from. Archaeology will solve this problem for us. Otherwise, in Hebrew, DN, normally spelled Dan. However, DN becomes 4 and 50 or 54. Sometimes in very early Hebrew, it was also written DN or DN apostrophe or apostrophe DN, which tended to confuse the scribes. Once major numerical errors began to show up, the later scribes wrote out the numbers phonetically to help end the confusion. However, all the earlier writings used the letters as number system. Most ancient languages used a similar system until about the 7th century AD. This system is still apparent from the use of Roman numerals being regular Roman letters, even today. In Europe, the first recorded use of separate number characters wasn't until 976 AD. Hebrew language conclusion. What have we gained from the synopsis of the ancient Hebrew language and translation problems? The Hebrew language is not easy to translate accurately into English. It is relatively ambiguous compared to English, and being pictorial, sometimes the true thought or action is not apparent. B. The capitalization, punctuation, and paragraph divisions are all the work of the translators. None of these were in the original codices. Because of this, some parenthetical statements were not indicated nor deduced by the translators. C. Hebrew names, when transliterated into another language, usually become altered in both pronunciation and spelling. That was your tail. That was a big bug. D. Early Hebrew numbers were written in different variations, therefore numbers coming from the earlier records may not be reliable. E. Hebrew words and names had no vowels, so the English spelling of a word was sometimes inconsistent between the teams of translators. F. Because the text was unctual, it was sometimes impossible to tell which words were proper names and which were not. Some were not translated that should have been. G. Occasionally the translators missed the pictorial point and translated the Hebrew words outside the context. This produced several meaningless passages. These few scant facts give us a pretty fair understanding into the character of the Hebrew language and the problems of translation. Being aware of these facts, we now know what type of errors to search for. Now onto the New Testament Greek. And we're going to stop there at page 32 because I am tired of reading and I'm going to eat ice cream and watch TV. Good night, you guys. Say good night, David.